Thank you all for being here. I'm John Sides. I'm a professor in the political science department at George Washington University. It's okay, my students talk when I talk anyway, so I'm used to it. We're really gratified to have three excellent scholars to talk to us today and to think about the spread of misinformation, beginning with Amber Boydston, who's a professor at the University of California, Davis, who said to me before we gathered here today, "I love being in DC," which made me wonder if perhaps she wasn't well or something was wrong. The last time I was in Davis, California, it was about 88 degrees and perfectly sunny, and here we are. So she's a scholar of the news media and political communication. We're also joined by Pablo Barbera, who is a political scientist at the London School of Economics, and has done a great deal of interesting research about social media, and in particular, this thing called Twitter, which you may have heard of. And then finally, Robert Ferris, who is a research director at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for the Internet and Society. And Robert has been involved in a lot of different research projects, but one in particular that I've always found very valuable was a lengthy report about the nature of news coverage of the 2016 election and the media ecosystem that was, in some sense, created in the context of that election, which he may be talking about a little bit today. So I'm going to turn it first to Amber for her opening thoughts on this subject.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's exciting to be here. I'd like to start in thinking about the spread of misinformation and disinformation by reiterating a point that both Jason and EJ made at the beginning, which is that this is not a new phenomenon, and it would be unfortunate and not a little bit ironic if we accidentally misrepresented or mischaracterized the prevalence and the criticality of misinformation and disinformation. It's always been the case since the beginning of human political communication that we have sought political information in order to understand the world, and we have used political information in order to try to share and promote our own views. That means that it's always been the case, because humans are fallible and because we have games of telephone, that we've had the spread of misinformation. And it's always been the case, because there have always been nefarious political actors among us, that we've had the spread of disinformation. It's also always been the case that misinformation and disinformation spread more easily than true facts, because they tend to be more salacious. And it's always been the case that it's all too easy for us to believe selectively those pieces of misinformation and disinformation that reinforce our own world views. But there have been a lot of things, of course, that have changed. And I do think that it's important to take stock of the role of misinformation in our current political reality, because I do think that it has a greater threat to democracy than it has in generations past. Lots of things have changed. We have, of course, this increasing spread of fragmentation of the media marketplace around the world, but especially in the United States. We have the strongest media marketplace competition of any place in the world. And that means that news outlets of all stripes are increasingly needing to appeal to our preferences and through things like clickbait to get us to pay attention to them, because they need our viewership. And it's also the case that we have an increasing ability, as John mentioned earlier, to self-select, to cherry-pick which pieces of news we want to get. It was the case in the 60s and 70s that we all got the same news. And it's probably no accident that it was during that period that there was the lowest association in recorded history between our partisanship and our votes, when we were all effectively getting the same information. It's also the case that we're increasingly polarized at the national level of politics, although importantly, there's not overwhelming evidence to suggest that Americans writ large are increasingly polarized. But to this list, I want to add something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially in my work with Regina Lawrence, and that's that we have, more than ever before in human history, an increasing blurring of the divide between entertainment and reality. and therefore between fiction and fact. It used to be the case not so long ago that there was a clear divide, that you turn to Walter Cronkite for fact, and you turn to the Lone Ranger for fiction. But it's not so clear anymore. We live in this saturated media environment. It's saturated not just with things like Game of Thrones and The Handmaid's Tale, but it's also saturated with shows that are entertainment shows, but they look a little bit like reality. So you can think of the Colbert Report or the various versions of The Office. And we also have reality shows. We have fact-based shows that are wrapped in entertainment shrouds. You can think of all reality TV, including, importantly, The Apprentice. And you can think of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. We have a lot of this. So we have this increasing blurring of the lines between entertainment and reality. And of course, we have also a president who heralds to us from the world of entertainment, as previous politicians have done. But unlike previous politicians, he has not lost the trappings of entertainment. He still purports himself in a way that looks as much like an entertainer as it does like a politician. So how are we in this kind of context to approach our selection and consumption of information? And I think especially for those of us who are academics, we have students in our college classrooms now who were born in the year 2000. They don't know a world before Fox News. They barely know a world before Breitbart. They certainly don't know a world before Twitter and Snapchat. And so how are they supposed to navigate this saturated entertainment world? Surely this kind of bleeding between fact and fiction in this entertainment-saturated environment is affecting us individually at a psychological level and collectively at a social level. And so that's the bad news, but I'll flip it as John did. But now I'll talk about the good news. And I think the good news is that when I think about my students in particular, they're remarkably savvy. Maybe because they grew up in this digital entertainment world, they're remarkably savvy. I would argue, and I don't know of any research that shows this, but anecdotally it seems like they're maybe even more savvy than us older generations at differentiating between the media that they consume. But largely, all of us, we're adaptive. We're an adaptive species and we're an adaptive society, and democracy itself is an adaptive entity. And so I think we can think of other parallels from past history in trying to understand how we might navigate this particular type of situation. So I've been thinking about potential parallels, and I want to just float one here. It's not going to work. It's going to break down in lots of ways, but bear with me. I've been thinking about the parallel of processed food. That it used to be the case that food was food, and we all ate food, and we then went through this period where all of a sudden we can't pronounce all of the ingredients in the food that is available to us in the grocery store. And at first, the general public, I think, wasn't aware. From what I've read, we weren't really aware of what was happening, but then we were aware, and we put policies into place to regulate the demarcation of different ingredients in the food that we buy, and we've gone through different waves of public education and awareness about the food that we consume. Well, if we think as a loose parallel about information, about our information diet, then we can think going forward of potential policies that we could put into place as a government and a society to help us regulate our information intake, but also, in general, a broader education campaign to coax us to be more self-aware of what we're consuming. But like this parallel with processed food, we can imagine that as a society, we're going to be differentially able to adapt based in large part on our socioeconomic status. That not unlike the food deserts that a lot of people encounter, some people don't have the money to buy a subscription to the Washington Post or the New York Times. They don't have the time to be self-aware of the kind of media they're consuming. And so that's the part that I think is to bring it back around to the sad news. I think that's the part that I am most concerned about, is that we're not all going to be equally able to adapt to this shifting information environment.
I did eat a lot of Velveeta cheese as a child.
Yeah,
I have to
explains
confess,
a lot.
And it's still delicious. Let me Let me ask you just a quick question by way of follow-up. And this is a theme maybe we can also talk about a little later in conversation, but one of the arguments that some scholars have made about the fragmentation of the news environment, or the media environment more generally, is that the consequence is not so much a self-selection effect in terms of, oh, I only want to consume news that is convenient to my partisanship or my ideology, but the bigger consequence is that people who are not really that interested in politics now have many, many options to, so you can turn on the news, you can turn on the TV at the news hour, and there is no longer any need to watch the news. You could watch, let's say, I don't know, a hockey game that maybe some of us were watching last night. So do we think that one of the consequences of fragmentation is not so much making people become more intensely partisan, but also just making people become less politically engaged?
Yeah, that's true, and that's concerning. The silver lining that I take is the work that several scholars have done on soft news, on the fact that even if you choose intentionally not to turn on the news at night and you don't read a newspaper, but instead you just watch daytime talk TV and you watch the morning show, you're still getting information, and it's still information that's relevant about the world. Would we prefer that people read the New York Times and the Washington Post? Absolutely, but we still pick up information in everything that we watch. But the flip side is that that's concerning, because we're still picking up political information about the world, even when we watch Game of Thrones, right? It influences the way that we think about politics.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Pablo.
Thank you. In my remarks, I want to focus specifically on the role of social media in the spread of misinformation. So we all know that social media websites like Facebook and Twitter are one of the most important vectors for the exposure to political misinformation. The same new technology that allowed opposition forces during the Arab Spring to literally start a revolution are now giving a platform to conspiracy theorists and actors that are seeking to manipulate the political agenda, either in their own political interest or financial interest. And it is true that attention to this problem spiked during the 2016 US presidential election, during which quote-unquote fake news were widely shared on social media and reached large number of citizens, propagated at least in part by foreign actors. According to survey data from the Pew Research Center, exposure to misinformation during this period was nearly universal. 75% of US adults report having seen at least some made-up news stories online. And some of my ongoing research has focused specifically on measuring and understanding the prevalence of misinformation on social media, which misinformation defined as news stories that appear to present political facts that are demonstrably false or misleading. And our goal so far has been to try to determine what are the cognitive and psychological factors that explain why someone would decide to click or share on a false news story. And to answer this question, we conducted an analysis of news stories being shared on Twitter during the 2016 election. And what we found was, to be honest, quite shocking. We found that stories from online websites that produce mostly misinformation were shared almost as often as all 16 most popular media outlets combined. So that includes New York Times, but also Fox News, CNN, MSNBC. So in other words, false stories were shared at rates comparable to actual news stories by mainstream outlets during this period. So at least when it comes to Twitter, during the 2016 election, there was as much misinformation being shared as actual news. However, it is also true that not every user shared misinformation at similar rates. We found significant heterogeneity in the extent to which users were likely to share, to propagate misinformation. The two most important factors were age and ideology. So individuals of ages 16 and more were 5 times more likely to share false news stories on Twitter than those ages 18 to 25, right? Which is interesting with your earlier point about young people perhaps being more savvy. And conservative users were twice as likely to share false news stories as moderates and liberals. So this part could be explained partially because there was a relatively higher prevalence of pro-Trump or anti-Clinton news stories during this period. But finally, if we're thinking about what explains why someone would click or share any false news stories, we need to look at age and ideology. These findings also align with the results from some excellent work by Andrew Guest from Princeton University and his co-authors, Brendan Nahan and Jason Reifler, who measured also individual news consumption in general online during this period and found that, again, age and alignment between individuals' ideology and the leanings of a specific news stories were the most important factors explaining why people were exposed to this idea. And this evidence and other evidence that points in the same direction has seemingly provided new fuel to this debate on the internet and social media as ideological echo chambers, like that already came up during our discussion today. And the prevailing narrative on this subject, put forward by authors such as Cass Sunstein or Eli Pariser, is that online misinformation is currently being amplified in partisan communities of like-minded individuals. In these online spaces, false news go unchallenged, in part thanks to perhaps all these ranking algorithms that are filtering out any dissenting voice. But despite this apparent consensus, my view is that the connection between online echo chambers, polarization, and the spread of misinformation is actually quite more nuanced than that. Empirical studies of news consumption in online settings have systematically found that exposure to diverse news is actually higher in social media than in other types of online or offline news consumption. Cross-cutting political exchanges are actually much more frequently than commonly assumed. And just to give you an idea of all the political stories that the average person sees on Facebook or Twitter, something like 1/3, 33%, do not align with their prior political beliefs. And in fact, some of my own research has found that, if anything, for most people, social media is actually having a depolarizing effect. So in other words, compared to other types of news consumption, exposure to political information on social media may be leading to ideological moderation for most people. Why? Because it's increasing the range of views to which we are exposed. But I mean, to be clear, that is not to say that there might be some individuals that are indeed fully embedded in completely homogeneous communities. We also found in our research that there are groups of people that are in these online spaces where agreement is basically the norm. So for these people, we may still expect to see some causal relationship between social media and the propagation of misinformation. But at this point, I think the empirical evidence clearly is telling us that the prevalence of ideological echo chambers on social media has been vastly overstated. And that leads me to my main point here in my initial remarks. The mechanism that has been determinant in explaining the spread of misinformation on social media is not the existence of political echo chambers. It's actually the opposite. Precisely because social media is increasing unfiltered exposure to political opinions across the aisle, citizens are now being increasingly exposed to all types of ideas. And that is also going to include conspiracy theories, hyper-partisan stories, and illiberal political opinions. To make sense of this apparent paradox, it is important to understand how specific social media features are transforming the way in which we consume news. Social media sites like Facebook or Twitter, what they do is they facilitate maintaining connections to both strong and weak ties, right? So in the classical work by Mark Granovetter, like sociologist in a work in the 1970s, he defines strong ties are those with whom we have the most interaction. So this is going to be like close friends, our relatives, etc. Weak ties are going to be acquaintances, distant relatives, co-workers, etc. And weak ties are crucially important because they expose us to new information, to diverse views, right? And this is where social media, I believe, represents a very profound shift in news consumption. It is now, thinking about who is delivering the news. Our friends are delivering the news, right? The stories to which we are exposed are in large proportion being shared by weak social ties, which are likely to be more ideologically diverse, right? So to make sense of this, just consider for a second, right? When was the last time you saw a false news story on social media? Who was the person that was sharing that story? Would you have seen that story in the age before social media, right? And I'm quite sure that for most of you, that person was this crazy uncle that already came earlier in the discussion, right? Who's always sharing all these political stories that are like bordering on conspiracy theories, right? So that person would still probably hold the same beliefs in the age before social media, but the difference is that now we're seeing it, right? Now it's not only during Thanksgiving dinners that we're exposed to those ideas, now we see it all the time on our newsfeed. So just to conclude, I think like the broader point that I'm trying to make here is that if we're going to assign blame for the spread of misinformation and potentially identify solutions to stop this spread, we should look not only at features of the platforms, but also at the broader news ecosystems, right? And that the psychological factors that explain how audiences select and process the news. And similarly, and I will end with this, it is important to understand the unintended consequences that certain interventions may have. So if we want to increase exposure to the other side, that may also increase exposure to conspiracy theories. And in contrast, right, because false news stories are often engaging and clickbaity and we like them, they attract the attention. If we stop, completely, let's say, if we ban completely false news, what could happen is that actually exposure to political information at all may actually decrease, right? Because a lot of people, they only click on a political story because it has like this like clickbaity thing, right? So it could be that that leads to less political interest, less civic engagement, etc. So testing this hypothesis is challenging. And, but in my opinion, these are the type of hard and maybe uncomfortable questions that we should be asking ourselves in the digital age.
Pablo, thank you. I want to say back to you what I think you just told us. It's not a surprise to me as a social scientist, but I don't think it's fully appreciated. If I don't get this quite right, you can adjust the terminology. But here we go. Most people do not live in a media echo chamber, and to the extent that they consume news via social media, they live in less of an echo chamber than people who don't consume news through social media.
Yes. So to be clear, it is the case that still like most of what the average person sees on social media aligns with their prior beliefs. But in isolation, that data point is not as relevant. What we need to do is like compare social media political consumption with the same but online in other places and offline, right? And if you compare those three spaces, on social media is definitely by far where people see most diverse news. Okay,
so in other words, most of what we think is true about echo chambers reflects an echo chamber of false news about echo chambers. Okay, and can I just get you to just say one other quick statistic, which I think is just a useful benchmark for us, particularly living as we do in this wonderful city of Washington, D.C. What percentage of Americans are actively Twitter users?
Which is something like 15, 20%.
15%, give or take. Okay. So 85% of Americans are not Twitter users. 85% of Americans. So God bless America. Rob Ferris.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my work and ideas on this important topic. So I've spent the past 2 years studying digital media and U.S. politics, along with colleagues at the Berkman Klein Center at MIT. We've built a platform specifically for this purpose called Media Cloud, and what it does is it collects news stories and it allows us to analyze and map those. And so we've done that for the U.S. election and the year after the election, and a few things jump out from this. So one of them, won't surprise anybody, is that we have different segments of the media ecosystem. Amber mentioned fragmentation before. We see that. That's clear in our media ecosystems. We've known that from surveys in the past. Conservatives trust one set of media, liberals trust another set of media, and our transpartisan sources of authority are endangered species right now. And that's deeply troubling, I think, for everybody. The next thing that jumped out from the research that did surprise us is that these media ecosystems, as we map them out, are asymmetric and profoundly asymmetric. And what I mean by that is that on one side of the media ecosystem, you have media sources that are in the center, center-left, and even the left that provide an integrated whole. They're interlinked. They cite each other's work. They're part of one media ecosystem. And at the other side, conservative media has moved off to the corner. It's more insular, it's more partisan, and the connective tissue, which would be the center-right, is stunted in US media communications. And that surprised us. And so we've spent the rest of our time trying to figure out what that means. And let me just pause there and say that this observation is, it's partisan. It sounds partisan, and it's a little bit awkward in that, but that's not just Cambridge, Massachusetts speaking. The data actually are very, very clear on that matter. What comes from this is that we have different ecosystems that are structurally and functionally different. And I want to explain how. So EJ started off by mentioning Lippman and objective journalism. That's one universe. And objective journalists, they have a different relationship with politicians, one which is often adversarial, sometimes friendly, but often adversarial. Partisan media has a different relationship with politicians in that it's mostly friendly. In fact, it's almost always friendly. And where partisanship and objectivity are at odds, partisan media, almost by definition, leans towards the partisanship and ends up with an adversarial relationship with objectivity and the truth at times. And it's obvious, I think, but I think it's overlooked very often that they're just functionally and structurally very, very different, and that what we have in political communication in the United States right now are functionally and structurally different media ecosystems that operate by different rules. And I think that explains a lot of what we see in disinformation right now. I also think it means that anytime we think about media and disinformation, that if we ignore that fact, we're going to get a lot of things wrong. So if you forget everything else I say, media ecosystems are partisan, they're polarized, and they're deeply asymmetric. What this also means is, I think we like to demonize people on the other side of the aisle frequently, but I think the thing to keep in mind on this is that the behavior and the practices and outcome of media have very strong structural and functional bases to them. So we may not like Sean Hannity, but Sean Hannity is almost inevitable as a part of this media universe. The things that lead to success, the standards of success, and the motivations that drive people are different on both sides. And were it not Sean Hannity, it would be someone else. And the roots of these things are structural. It's not personal. It's not a matter of integrity, honesty, any of those things. It's just these deep ecosystems, which have been decades in the making, are producing these outcomes. And that's what we have to grapple with. So I want to just throw one more thing by this lens, which is thinking about the sources of this information in media. So there's a lot of culprits out there. There's Facebook algorithms, there's crazy uncles, a little bit close to home when you say Bob, but I'm a Rob, so I'm okay with it. Media manipulators, clickbait factories, people with a mix of commercial and political motivations to feed people partisan BS. They're out there, Russians, those kinds of things. But what we see is that they are interacting through these existing media ecosystems. And for me, it's less troublesome, or it's less consequential, the source of disinformation out there, than the ability of that disinformation to gain traction within media ecosystems. And what we've seen is that conservative media, because of these structural elements, is more vulnerable to disinformation than the Lippman objectivity, fact-based journalism that we see that's rooted in many, many decades of practice and behavior. And that's kind of what we're looking at there. It means that we can be worried about Russians, but the more important part is the larger media sources and what they're doing with this information, and whether they're seeking to tamp this down or seeking to amplify it in what they do. And that's what we saw in the past election. We've seen it over the past year, when you see Uranium One becoming a big story on Fox News, or the Seth Rich conspiracy, or repeated coverage of the deep state going after Donald Trump. Those are particular functional and structural aspects of conservative media. And we see the bubbling up on social media of craziness on both sides. And for me, the more important question is, how far does it get in? And I don't know the evidence on this, so maybe some of the fine scholars here will have an idea of this, but it seems fundamentally different to me if you hear a rumor on Facebook and you wonder, is this true or not? We all know to treat things you see on Facebook with a good degree of skepticism. It becomes a different matter if you read it on Facebook, it comes through email, you hear it on the radio, and then you see it on TV. That's a very, very different world than hearing it on Facebook and the New York Times telling you it's not true. Final point I want to leave you with is that we would like to blame a lot of the current problems on technology. EJ said in the beginning, technology is neutral. Technology feeds through social and political processes. And if technology were the problem, we would see these problems resulting in more or less equal measure on both sides, and we do not. So let's not point all fingers at technology. We need to be wary of it, and there's things we can do to try to improve the way social media is intermediating media, but our problems run much deeper than that.
Thank you, Rob, or Uncle Rob.
Crazy Uncle Rob,
yeah,
in my family.
It may be useful just to, without going too deep into the arcane details, but to talk a little bit about how you're mapping these ecosystems. So if you go and read the work that Rob and others have done with the Berkman Klein Center, you'll see these maps where each media outlet's a little circle. And the ones that are more central to the network are kind of close to the middle, and the ones that are further out are sort of more peripheral. And then there's little lines that connects these circles, and that measures the sort of extent to which they interact with each other in different ways. And so when he's talking about center left or left kind of in one sphere and right in another sphere, that's because there's not a lot of ties that connect those two different networks from each other. There's an insularity. So how are you measuring, what data are you gathering to sort of map that network?
Thanks. So two different measures which complement each other. So there's no one single view of a media ecosystem that tells the whole picture. It's a little bit like the blind people and the elephant, where you're feeling around and describing a different beast by the way you look at it. One way we do it is by looking at the interlinking patterns between media sources. So when the New York Times chooses to link to the Washington Post and not to Fox News, or sites within the right-wing media ecosystem link to each other and less to the others, it creates a map. And what that map reflects is a media-centric view of the media ecosystem, according to the authors and editors of the media ecosystem. We have another map that reflects the behaviors of Twitter users. So we leverage the proclivity of Twitter users to share similar media sources. So we have two very, very different views of the media ecosystem, one based upon writers from Fox News and Breitbart and the New York Times, and the other based upon the 15% of Twitter users, which is a broader subset. Mm-hmm. And they offer similar but slightly different views of media.
Can you also just say a little bit, you talked about the stunting of the Centerright. Can you just give a little bit more detail about what that looks like in your network map? And has anything changed from 2016 to 2017 in the way that these different media within the political right function?
Sure. So the center-right are people that get most of their attention from the right, but also get some attention from the left and center as well. And that's what defines the center-right. And the folks that are in that camp are the National Review, the Weekly Standard, the Federalist. A lot of them were Trump skeptics and never Trumpers. And they were effectively sidelined in the 2016 election. As the partisan lines were drawn, you were either with Trump or were not with Trump. And the Trump skeptics weren't getting much attention from the left or the right as a result. That hasn't changed that much in the past year. I think the partisan lines are drawn as cleanly and strongly as before.
Even with the decline of Breitbart, based on traffic statistics and other kinds of things, do you think it's as central a node as it was in 2016? Because in some sense, it took the place of what you would have normally ascribed, of a place you would normally have ascribed to the Centerright publications, the venerable National Review, after all, right? Do you think that's changed in the wake of the election?
I want to harken back to Amber's point about intense competition within media now. Okay. So we see a much stronger demand response in media. And so one of the factors that certainly led to Breitbart's success during the election was that they carved out a very strongly early pro-Trump position that Fox News was not able or willing to make at that point. And I think what we see in this changing prominence over time was that Breitbart was sucking a lot of attention that Fox News otherwise would have gotten. Since the election, Fox News is not conflicted about where their loyalties lie. They're not worried about Rubio or about Cruz any longer. And I think that they've regained their audience in part because of that. And I think that might also explain why Breitbart has fallen in prominence.
Thank you. So I want to ask a question of all of you guys. And I want to harken back to EJ's comments about, and Amber echoed this, none of this is new. None of this is new. Many of these things are features of American politics. I would often go so far as to say that it's actually better now than it used to be. Better than the era of yellow journalism. We have a journalism that is not yellow journalism, that didn't exist to the extent that it does now. We have news outlets that strive for objectivity that didn't exist in a world where newspapers had partisan affiliations, and then in earlier eras of American politics, explicit partisan subsidies, cash, right, given to them by political factions and actors. So you don't have to agree with that statement by any stretch, but I guess the question I would like to ask is, what's the right way to put the environment today in context? I mean, should we be comparing it to the 1800s, and then maybe we feel better? Or should we be comparing it to like Walter Cronkite and we feel worse? And I think that's an important question, because adjacent to this conversation about, hashtag misinformation is a conversation about democracy in decline, and in the United States and elsewhere. And there's a lot of emotion in that debate that sometimes feels to me to be fairly ahistorical, fairly like what happened 20 minutes ago is the most important thing that's ever happened in the history of American politics. But maybe I'm just being sort of contrarian. Like maybe I should wake up every morning and be more alarmed every single day. So how do we grapple with this question of is it bad today? Like what are we supposed to compare today to in order to get an intelligent answer to that question?
Well, I'll start. Yeah. Well, that's the magic question. I think that's the magic question, and it's all relative. I don't think I would say, maybe just because I don't want to say, but I wouldn't say that democracy is in decline. I would say democracy is in flux, but it's always been in flux, right? We've always had to challenge something. I personally, and also as an academic, am less concerned about the role of misinformation than I am the role of mistrust. And those are aligned, but I think they're orthogonal. They're different conceptually and they're different practically. That the steepest, sharpest danger I think we face is that we're increasingly not trusting our government, we're increasingly not trusting the media, and we're increasingly not trusting each other, specifically not just Uncle Rob, but all of our friends who are across the aisle, who I'd reiterate science shows that we're not, in fact, writ large, becoming more polarized as citizens, and yet we're distrusting each other more. So I think that's dangerous. It's certainly reason for concern, but as you say, there's lots of things to like about our current form of democracy and our current form of the media landscape that we didn't have before. Only one of which is that individual citizens really do have more agency now than they used to, and that is a good thing and a bad thing potentially, but it's also a good thing.
I mean, to me, the irony is had a few thousand votes gone in the other direction in 2016, would we be here talking about misinformation? Would we be having this moment of wow, there's this crisis, right? So I think our role as scholars is to take one step back and think, put things into perspective.
There would be so many fewer Brookings panels right now. It would be amazing. This place would be a ghost town. Just kidding. Go ahead.
Yeah.
There's always going to be Brookings panels. It doesnn't matter what's happening.
Yeah, so to me, so I agree, misinformation is not new. I think perhaps what is a bit troubling is this mistrust in the media. And I think more generally, I think there's a crisis of method in the sense that across different fields, if you feel science or the media or government, there's crisis in terms of what, not the output per se, but just the way things work, the basic principles, journalism, the standards, right? Now there's this multiplicity of news outlets that pretend to be very serious, to produce very serious journalism, but in a way that don't follow the same standards. Or in science, there's all this fake science now that, this crisis of reproducibility. There is also a crisis in terms of not following the right standards. So I think that's what we should be focusing on and trying to make sure that, we follow the rules and we don't get taken away by the moment in which we're living.
Rob?
I'm going to agree with the panel that the thing we should be concerned about is the erosion of institutions that speak to everyone across the populace, and that misinformation, disinformation is not unrelated to that, but it's an underlying problem that we need to worry about. We're going to have a hard time comparing this to other things. It's new and different now, and for better or worse, social media and the internet, digitally mediated communication has changed our world in important ways that I don't think we fully understand yet. I guess I would just reiterate that it's a weird feels like a transitional outcome now that things look so different on one side than the other. I don't think that that's permanent, but I'm not really sure what to make of it. But we can't go back to Walter Cronkite, and that wasn't perfect either. There were catastrophic media failures at that time as well. And we have some more new and different catastrophic media failures ahead of us as well.
Can I add something?
Sure.
So Rob's work shows nicely that the behavior of media systems is structural. It's rooted not in personality or in personal aspects, but in incentives and institutions. But if we were to think of a simulation where all we do is we put in a set of incentives for a given news outlet, then all we would get is clickbait, right? That's the natural conclusion of the types of incentives for news systems on the left and on the right and in the center. So I take great comfort in the fact that we have so much investigative journalism still today. That's not a product. That's a product of professionalism and institutions, but it's not a product of the marketplace. And that tells me that there are still people, there's still many journalists who care about getting things right and getting things right, not in a quick manner, but in an investigative manner. But there are also consumers who are continuing to ignore the clickbait and to pay attention to those deeper, truer stories.
If I could just add to that, we would be remiss to not mention the decline of local journalism, which is
absolutely.
That I think everyone agrees upon.
Yeah. That may be, that should be the next panel.
Let me ask you guys one more question, and then we'll do take some questions from the audience. Amber gave us the wonderful metaphor of processed food.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to steal that for years to come. I think So, I mean, we all know that, Velveeta is sort of not as good as kale, and we should all
But delicious.
should all eat more kale. But then, without trying to argue with you in any way that I could tell, but Pablo sort of raised this interesting idea that there are lots of unanticipated consequences when we try to sort of put parameters on what gets published or what people pay attention to, because for most of us, the more we consume, the more we consume. All right? And so the more we get of the bad, the more we get of the good at the same time. So poaching again on the third panel, as the first panel did, is there a way to get us from Velveeta to kale that doesn't end up with a perverse kind of consequence? Pablo raised the specter that we just wouldn't actually get as much information, period. We would become less politically engaged and informed, because we're trying to avoid being misinformed. Okay. So is there a way to thread this needle?
Well, I think we should be cautious about policy, because policy is something that is much easier to implement than it is to take away. And I think there are all kinds of unintended consequences that we can see. I don't want someone to tell me that I have to eat kale for lots of reasons. I don't want someone to tell me that, right? I want to be able to make my own food choices, and that makes sense. But I also want everyone to have equal access to kale if they want it, and I want people to be at least equally available, equally able to be informed about the relative health benefits of kale and Velveeta. And so in my mind, it's more about information and awareness on a citizen level, but also I'll return to this point about how I think especially because of the decline of local news, we are facing not just a challenge of misinformation and disinformation, but a disproportionate challenge of those things for people, for example, of lower socioeconomic status. And so I don't know what kind of policy we could put into place, but I mean, it's hard to imagine a subsidization system by the government that is something that would appeal to us in a normative way, but I don't know. I don't have a good answer.
So my answer is also we don't know, but I will explain why we don't know it. I think this is a really hard question, right? So let's assume for a second that we want to implement a policy that will make fake news forbidden, right? Like we are going to tell the platforms, delete any fake news. First of all, what is fake news? Like this is a question that we haven't really discussed, but it's actually really hard to identify what is fake news, because in a lot of fake news articles, there's always a nugget of truth, right? There's hyper-partisan stories, which might be true but misleading. There's completely false stories, and there's a whole grays in the middle. So first of all, it's very hard to define. Second, even if we make fake news forbidden in, let's say, social media, there's now a multiplicity of platforms, right? We're getting news in our watches now, right? So how do we come up with a comprehensive way of doing that? And it's also a problem for measurement, right? We don't know exactly. First of all, very basic questions like how much of what proportion of all the political news that we see are misleading or false stories. We just don't know. So coming up with potential policy proposals to fight fake news, first we run into this world of well, there's all these challenges, are really hard methodologically and substantively.
Rob?
I'll agree. I can't imagine a policy prescription that would be palatable in the U.S. context at this point. I think anything that would try to limit the production and distribution of political speech is kind of the third rail, and rightly so. I think we have a lot of things that we can and should try in the meantime to shore up things, and that the roots of solutions are not in law or even in technology, but are in politics, and that's where we ought to go before that.
Let's take some questions. Yes, ma'am, you were quick on the draw. There's a microphone coming to you on your right.
Hi, my name is Meredith Mackenzie. I'm here on behalf of the NYU Center for Business and Human Rights. And you mentioned, that we should be concerned about Russia, but really, and even in the last panel, they said, well, we're here to talk about American misinformation, but how much of it comes from Russia, and what is the responsibility of businesses to look at their model and what they're profiting off of misinformation? You said that maybe the solution's in politics, but is there a solution for tech companies and media businesses?
You got this.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, no, because I mean, the way I think about this is like, why do we see fake news from like the supply side? And like, part of it is like there's financial incentives, like all these like, there's a stories in BuzzFeed about like kids in Macedonia creating fake news pages simply because they're making a lot of money out of it. But then also, Russian propaganda, which in many ways, in many cases, like very difficult to identify, is like politically motivated. So I think it's very challenging to like come up with ways to fight this. But I mean, I agree. And I think like a broader point is like, again, all the discussion so far has focused on like fake news, mostly in the US. But in other countries, right? So here in the US, we're worried about democracy. But in other countries, we're worried about genocide, right? Like there's like places like Myanmar and Sri Lanka where false stories are being shared, and that's leading to political violence. And like that's also like something that we should pay attention to.
So it's easy to imagine trying to prevent using all means necessary to prevent foreign intervention in U.S. elections. I think that doesn't bump up against First Amendment protections and ought to be pursued. There are limits to it. I mean, there's a few things we could do. The Honest Ads Act, which would require online ads to disclose who's actually financed those ads, I think is a good, sensible idea. There's nuances and complications with any such things. How do we know who's where and what lengths do we go to document that is a hard question. A more difficult question is what's political and what's not, and where one draws the line around that. But I think that makes sense, and there are things that can and should be done. I think social pressure on social media companies is appropriate as well. And again, it's a political social solution to a political and social problem, which is ask them to do better in certain circumstances. And it's not government policy, it's not binding upon everyone. But we're just going to have to muddle through. There's no easy answers to any of that.
I'll just add that that in thinking about potential Russian interference, it's really a difference of resources. It's not that we have to look outside our country for people with political aims who are trying to game the system to influence a people. It's just that in these documented cases, there was an excess of resources. And that doesn't make it a small thing, but it's an exaggeration of an existing problem.
David, right there.
Thanks. I tried to be quick on the draw. This is David Barker. I'm from AU. My question is mostly for everybody's new favorite uncle, but others can chime in too if you want to. I'm very interested in the two media echo chambers that you described that allow most of the people in this room to pat themselves on the back in terms of the center and center-left echo chamber that tries to adhere to traditional Lippman-esque journalistic standards, and then the right-wing echo system. But I'm wondering if your analyses are recent enough, or if you're seeing any changes in the last year and a half on that. Anecdotally, it just feels like, when I watch late night TV and we see that Stephen Colbert got a lot more popular when he decided to go full-throated against Trump every night. Jimmy Fallon lost a lot of popularity when he refused to do that for a time, and then now has jumped on board. When I pay attention to Twitter, and even honestly when I look at the headlines in my Washington Post feed in my inbox every morning, it feels to me like the traditional center and center left is becoming a little bit more foxy. And then I could talk about podcasts too, right? The popularity of Save America and whatnot seems a lot like, political talk radio. So I'm wondering if there's any evidence, again, that both on the right, that Fox is becoming more foxy, but that the traditional center and center left are also becoming more foxy.
Thank you for the question. It's a good one. So we've kept tabs on the past year, and Colbert and Jimmy Fallon do not appear in our analyses. So they are not getting the same traction within Twitter and within the media ecosphere that mainstream media is. And Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Politico Hill, they are as they have been. They certainly have a clearer focus than they had in the past, but there are still people in the room, and the people running these organizations are still saying, eat your kale, and insisting that their reporters serve kale. So I don't think that has changed that much.
You're welcome.
The left is certainly more energized than they were before. There was an enthusiasm gap prior to the election where the partisan right was much more engaged with things. And we have seen evidence that that has shifted since the election. And I think that that is partially reflected in Colbert and Fallon. But I don't even know where to place them in the media ecosystem. I mean, they fall in that kind of entertainment, political kind of muddle that is hard to describe, which we wish didn't exist. And on the right, things are as they were. If nothing else, right-wing media is more unified than it was before, as it's not an election period any longer. The difference being that they are more on the defensive than the offense as they were before, though you do see a surprising amount of offense. I mean, going after the Clintons well after the election is a sign of that was a successful way to do business and continues to be there. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that part of the asymmetry between the left and the right media is not only the degree of network closeness, but also the nature of the media. So the first panel talked about how talk radio, or at least, about how talk radio is almost exclusively on the right, and late night comedic news-based shows are almost exclusively on the left. And that may be indeed exclusively for institutional reasons, but I wonder, I think it's an interesting question. Danica Young at the University of Delaware is writing a book right now on the psychological links between conservatives and liberals and comedy. And yeah, I can't wait to read that book. You should check out that book. Yeah.
If I may add just like very quickly, so some of our research that I've done with some colleagues has found like similar asymmetries between the left and the right, and looking at change in recent, basically after the election, like the big thing that the big movement has been CNN from a relatively, at least perceived centrist position to the left. But something that I think it's important to take into account here when we think about these issues is that, one thing might be the average perceived ideology of an outlet, but I think it's also important to have like the range of views that to which they give you they expose you to, right? Like CNN is famous for like giving voice to both sides of of an issue, whereas like maybe Fox News or MSNBC, which are like relatively more extreme, may only give you like one side of the debate. But so that's also important.
Yes, ma'am, right here in the front. Yeah, you.
Ann Bellinger, retired intelligence analyst, and I want to ask you all a question, but Dion might be able to answer this. Why can't we fight back if we really want truth as opposed to fake news? We could do what the Post did last week, which had a one-page, do you remember that blue page? It was unattributed, which makes me somewhat suspicious. I suppose I know who paid for it, and good for you if that's true. But we don't have to take this. Do you want to find out what the truth is? You could go to a library. Librarians are trained. Right? Are there any librarians? Okay. Must be. Librarians are trained to show you what is true, what is not, what can be a source of information. And this is something you don't have to have the money to subscribe to all the newspapers and things, journals that I like to subscribe to. But most people do have access to a library. Could you all address yourself to that?
Yeah, actually, this is something I wanted to ask. So I'm going to ask it the way that I was going to ask it, which is the same point that you're making. when we talk about policy, we think, well, we got to fix this. How are we going to fix this? And we say, well, we can't do very much because, First Amendment, et cetera. Or it's harder to categorize fake news, and I think that's absolutely right. So I guess my way of framing this question is there a way then that should our focus be on, let the Velveeta people make the Velveeta, fine. How do we help the kale growers, right? Like that's a different way of approaching this issue, which gets into the economics of the news business, also gets into the personal choices that people may or may not make as consumers. But are there ways that we might? I mean, EJ and I both, helped to write for a publication that is now owned by a very wealthy man. It turns out that's a pretty good way to get money, as far as I can tell. He doesn't pay me. I'm not a paid employee of the Washington Post, so this is not no conflict of interest here. But that's one way to do it. But are there other ways to strengthen ecosystems that are truth providers in ways that enable them to be a counterbalance to misinformation, a counterbalance to Russian misinformation, a counterbalance to just rank partisanship or anything else that we think might not be the information that voters need or Americans need to be good citizens? This is your last word on this panel, so go for it.
Well, money goes a long way, and I think money to fund more libraries and better infrastructure in libraries, and money to fund all of the various news outlets that are producing kale, that would go a long way, especially if that money, again, could go towards funding subscriptions for people to get through the paywall for people who can't afford it. There are a number of newspapers that offer student discounts. That's great, but there are lots of people beyond students who just can't afford it. The harder task, I think, is time. That it's a very different thing to ask someone to consume a newspaper article, even online, than it is to ask them to glance at Twitter in the morning. It's just a very different task, and increasingly as our economic workplace is shifting, it's harder and harder, I think, again, specifically for lower socioeconomic people, to ask them to take that time.
I just want to highlight the role of civic education and digital literacy here, right? Like a lot of the patterns that we're seeing are due to the fact that a lot of people don't understand that when they see something on social media or the internet, sometimes it's going to be false, right? Like there are people actively trying to mislead you either for financial or political reasons. So I think developing that conscience of hey, think twice when you're reading something. Look for the reputation of the outlet and learning how to do that. And that's something not only to be taught in schools, but farther in life, right? Something that we've seen the role of age in explaining the diffusion of fake news. I think the role of education is something we should definitely think about.
Rob.
So that's the right question, and it has no easy answer. My sense is that it's the everyday work of building democracies that we have to re-engage with, and that's everywhere from funding libraries and paying teachers better salaries and buying subscriptions to newspapers and donating money to philanthropic organizations are all the things that we need to do. And we need to try to fend off polarization and partisanship where we can. I think one of the big concerns is the encroachment of political life on all aspects of the collective endeavor, and that the more that gets politicized, the less likely are we to come to kind of reasonable collective decisions on things moving forward. But
we're going to take a 10-minute break and reconvene at 11:45. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Okay.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.